Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Encore episode of the Psychology Talk podcast. Welcome to the Psychology Talk podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Hoye. The Psychology Talk podcast is a unique conversation about psychology from around the globe. We bring you ideas from mental health practitioners and experts to keep you informed about the latest issues and trends. Topics include developments and research in psychotherapy and social sciences, hypnosis and mind-body treatments, meditation and spirituality, and new treatment modalities. And while you're listening, please take a moment to subscribe and give us a review at your favorite streaming site. It helps us to grow and further reach people with quality programming. And now, here's the episode. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. Today, my guest is Maggie Craddock. Maggie is an executive coach with over 20 years of experience working with clients at all levels of the professional spectrum. She's known for her work with Fortune 500 CEOs and senior management teams. She's a partner in the coaching company Workplace Relationships. Maggie received her Master of Science degree from the London School of Economics and holds an MSW from New York University. She received her BA in Economics from Smith College, and she is an Ackerman certified family therapist. Maggie Craddock, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, we are too. So, you have a new book. You can certainly plug your book, which I brought you on the show, right? which I have to say, it flows like a narrative. The book is called Lifeboat, right? And it's basically kind of a business coaching book, but it's more than that. And it's such a great metaphor that it uses the Titanic disaster and how people were able to kind of overcome the obstacle of getting to safety within a lifeboat, and using that within narratives of case studies for business coaching clients. So I felt that it read more like a really wonderful narrative. It was really engaging and informative, and the metaphor was a great way to kind of help to teach people which metaphors are, because they're a bit of a spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine goes down with the life lesson. But we can start with that. But maybe you can talk a little bit about yourself, because you are a family therapist and you do hold an MSW from the esteemed New York University. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your own background and maybe some of the lifeboats you've been in.
Oh, sure. Well, Scott, executive coaching is a second career for me, right? I worked for a long time as a portfolio manager on Wall Street. And so in that first career, my team was really instrumental in the fact that we won 2 Lipper Awards for National Fund performance around the world. And I think what that experience taught me was it wasn't so much what we did, and I was certainly proud of our results. It was how we did it, because that team worked together, and we didn't just know what good looked like, Scott. We knew what good felt like. We really supported each other. We were present with each other. It's like the Camelot experience of trading groups. We even have reunions, right?
That's unusual. Yeah.
We loved each other, and those of us that are still around still do. But what that taught me was something very fundamental about psychology that actually led to my making a career change. And that was understanding. And I think this applies to everyone right now when they're thinking about their lives and careers and families and decisions. How we operate when it's business as usual is really not the same as the way we respond under pressure. Correct. And the skills we need, right, to deal with normal situations aren't the same skills that we need to navigate the incredible level of unprecedented change and disruption at all levels in our lives today. And that's why, and I've had a lifelong love affair with the story of the Titanic, but that's why this particular metaphor is so interesting right now. Because, Scott, at a really human level, so many of us are asking ourselves the very same types of questions that probably ran through the hearts and minds of those Titanic survivors on those lifeboats. Things like, how long will this last? How bad will it get? Who can I trust? under pressure. And I guess most important for your listeners is, how will going through this period change me?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly at this point in time, I noticed as I was reading it, the publication date was in May of 2020. So you didn't have time to add anything about the COVID-19 situation, but it's certainly apropos. And I would recommend people, if they're looking for ways to kind of navigate the stormy seas of the current situation, it's a fantastic book. All sorts of stuff. Associations were coming up with me right now, as far as my own practice in psychology and what other people are just going through in their lives. So, well, the metaphor is very engaging. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you chose this metaphor. You've written a couple other books, like maybe you should mention those too.
Well, I think that what really pulled me into this particular metaphor for people. And I have to say the timing has been extraordinary because I've been working on this book for like 5 years, Scott.
Wow.
I had no idea that it was going to come out in the midst of a period where this metaphor was going to be so timely. And I'll tell you, as incredible as the timing is, I wouldn't have wished for these conditions, right? But one of the things that I've always believed as someone who tries to help people understands many of the things they often rush through life preferring not to know about themselves, right? Mm-hmm. So they can operate with other people more effectively under pressure. Things like those blind spots that stem from the family system we're raised in, right?
Correct,
because one thing we realize with people under pressure is when you're in a high stress situation, people have different triggers. Mm-hmm. For instance, they have different ways of responding to something as interesting as conflict. Some people will just sit in a room and be invisible in plain sight whenever a discussion gets contentious. Mm-hmm. And other people lean in like it's a competitive sport. And they think if they're not fighting, they're not bringing their A game to the job, right? And sometimes it's not even necessarily a matter of good or bad. It's just how everybody's power styles are morphing under pressure, right? Mm-hmm. Depending upon how they were conditioned to respond, the norms in their family system. You know, I'm a huge fan of Virginia Satir. Mm-hmm. And depending upon the emotional triggers that are going on in that particular moment, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But that's why I realize, particularly with what we're dealing with right now, as we make this shift in businesses and we make this shift in the business of running our families at a time like this, I'm always trying to help people understand the difference, Scott, between what I refer to as the big ship mindset, right?
Correct, yeah.
And the lifeboat mindset,
yeah,
okay?
Yeah.
So when I'm talking about the big ship mindset, the first thing I'll say for your listeners is I'm really not talking about the size of an organization or anything like that. There are multinational organizations out there with senior executives really trying to embrace a lifeboat perspective. Mm-hmm. What I mean by the big ship mindset is a mindset that's rooted in old norms. So one of the things about the story of the Titanic I've always loved is that the problem started before the ship ever left port. Right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, they were cutting corners. They didn't have enough lifeboats. We all know this. They're racing through the icy waters of the Atlantic a lot more quickly than they needed to because the whole thing was about impression management. It was rooted in old norms. This will never happen to me, and stretching those old norms to their extreme. And so where that starts to map into how we navigate our lives and our careers is the way that those norms sort of incented people was they learned to play their part, keep their game face on under pressure, right? You know, just tamp down uncomfortable feelings, stay busy all the time, and, you know, faster's better. And of course, we all know in our lives and careers, if we're moving too quickly to take care of our clients or our family members, we're moving a little too quickly. So here is the central part of the lifeboat metaphor. On those lifeboats, suddenly you have all these people that had come from this gigantic ship that was heralded as unsinkable. And now they're huddled together in these tiny watercraft. They don't know each other. In the icy waters of the Atlantic, wondering how they're going to survive. And the norms that come out of this are what the lifeboat process in the book is all about. Right. The first one is be present with other people, mm-hmm. right? The second one is learn to take strategic pauses, and we could do a whole webcast on that, Scott. And the third one is in the overall mindset, try to align your thoughts and feelings and intentions in the present, because that's how you make that shift from what I call the me first self-help mindset to the us help mindset. And that's critical for survival under high pressure conditions.
So it becomes more about shifts from personal power and personal management to more of an affiliation kind of mindset.
And I don't know how those things can be separated, right? Because power, the way that I look at it, is relational, right? Power almost has a 3-part definition when I apply it to coaching clients. Power is about your relationship with yourself, which is largely what you need to have to chart your own course professionally and not have that dictated by outside forces, right? Power is about your ability to interact with others in an emotionally agile way. So that goes to whether or not you can do things like negotiate conflict in a way that fortifies your personal integrity rather than diminishing it, which we see a lot when people are in blind spots. And then what I really think the Lifeboat process helps people understand is power when it comes to running their families, managing their lives, or even finding an organization or a job where they're going to thrive, has to do with supporting groups that reinforce your core values.
Right.
And when necessary, right, making a healthy break with those that don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the book goes through those kind of like when I took a few notes here. I was a good student. I took a few notes here.
I'm so flattered.
Professor Craddock. Okay. So, well, the book is a very good book. And so it's helping me, and it will help me, when I remember it in the future, like when some of these things, it seems that there's 2 kinds of approaches that the book elucidates, right? Being stuck in that big ship or old paradigm model, and then being in the lifeboat. But also there's a kind of, the old paradigm model is to react and to keep the norms going, or to be stuck in those norms and not be aware of your inner emotions and the outer situation and responding. So there's a reactive way to approach things, and there's a responsive way to approach things, it looks like. And when you're really working the lifeboat process, you're responding, and you're not afraid of inner icebergs or blind spots. Like you go into the blind spots and you turn some lights on.
I think that's actually beautifully said, Scott. I mean, there are 2 characters in the book that are really an interesting contrast. One of them is Quartermaster Robert Hitchens. You notice him in the book,
yeah,
right? And he's the guy who's holding the wheel of the Titanic while the giant ship is hurtling at an iceberg at top speed. And in one of, I think, history's really amazing stories of like responsibility with no authority, the man is not allowed to turn the boat until he's given a command by a superior officer. And of course, that happens a little too late and tragedy ensues. And we pick him up later when he's put in charge of Lifeboat number 6. Mm-hmm. And he just is underwhelming in that job because based on those old norms, what happens is a high pressure situation happens. He, as you just said, Scott, is reacting all over the place. He's literally imploding because, of course, he's probably wondering if he's going to be blamed for part of what happened on the big ship writ large. But whatever the case, he's picking fights. He's pessimistic. He doesn't think anything can happen. And instead of being aware of his feelings in the present moment, he's coming undone and creating a narrative in his own mind that casts him as the victim and justifies his reaction. And he's frozen in place. And we contrast that in the book with the character of Margaret Brown.
Yeah.
Right?
The unsinkable Molly. Yeah.
That's one of the reasons I've loved the story my whole life, Scott, because my mom took me to see the unsinkable Molly Brown as a little girl. And I started reading history books behind those characters and just fell in love with that story. Right. But here comes Molly Brown, who's a gracefully aging grandmother in first class. The only reason she's on the boat is to get to the bedside of her seriously ill grandson. Right. So she's getting on this lifeboat, focused on human life and the value of it. And when she's on that lifeboat, she's watching, Robert Hitchens start to get into a power struggle. I think with all the other women on the boat, she's kind of hoping he works that out. And she begins noticing at a very human level that people around her are cold. Mm-hmm. She gives them clothing. They need to sort of be corralled together so they don't move into factions. She's with a lot of women in first class that are getting very agitated because they're used to having things smoothed over for them, and things are not going smoothly, Scott, right? So she's working through that. She notices, and I think this is ingenious, that even though these women individually aren't strong enough to row those lifeboats, if she puts them together two to an oar and they get a rhythm, they're going to keep warm, they're going to survive the night, they're going to be unified, and they're going to move. And then when Hitchens sees her do that, he's still coming undone, but he wants that formal command. Remember those old norms. He's got a part to play. Mm-hmm. And when he tries to stop her, that's when she summons this incredible strength she may not have even known she had. And she commandingly gets him to stand down, and everyone else on the lifeboat in this wave of unity stands behind her. When they get rescued, they're all crediting Margaret Brown as the strength that saved them all. I tell people when we look at this lifeboat process, one of the things we learn from the example of Margaret Brown is when you're facing the unknown, often, like Margaret Brown, we don't think our way to greatness because we have more questions than answers. What she did was she aligned her thoughts, her feelings, and her intentions, and she kept taking constructive action in the present moment, and greatness found her.
Right. Which is true leadership.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I think it's authentic leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We're, and the only reason I say that, Scott, is we're seeing some dysfunctional examples of leadership that can be a little autocratic around the world right now. But
I think a little autocratic.
I just mentioned that in passing, right?
Yeah.
But I do think that she embodied an approach to leadership that stemmed from a commitment to connecting with others at an authentic level, rather than emotionally erasing them or just bullying right through.
Okay.
Right?
Well, what are some of the steps when you have these blind spots? You mentioned them a little bit earlier. Obviously, I know them. I'm just playing devil's advocate here. But what are some of the steps? Maybe what would the reactive response be? You kind of spelled them out, but maybe you can be a little bit more explicit, and so that the audience gets it a second time and may be able to take something away from it. So, sure, the reactive versus the responsive.
Well, I think that one of the things that your audience may really appreciate, and at some level many people probably already know this, but it can't hurt to hear it again, okay, is that under normal conditions, we all go through this process when we're facing a choice or a change, whether it's to change jobs or to get through a situation where members of your family are cranky picket, right? But we all have a way that we deal with our thoughts. And when it's business as usual, usually, hopefully, we're kind of objective and logical. Maybe we're even strategic, right? We have a way we deal with our feelings. So, under relatively normal conditions, we like to think that we're able to sort of, suppress uncomfortable feelings enough to stay focused, right? We have a role that relationships play in how we navigate things. Mm-hmm. And then when we bring it all together, right, we sort of take action, don't, and it has to do with what's going on in our inner world and our outer world. Okay. Here's the steps that unfold in this process. Under pressure, you're not going to be as logical, and your thoughts can get polarized. Mm-hmm. You can get prone to snap judgments. Okay. You can get prone to black and white thinking, right? Under pressure, you're going to have emotional triggers that can come in. Mm-hmm. And even if you're a really brilliant, logical person, those emotional triggers can flood you with adrenaline. And the smartest people don't have access to the brilliance we know they've already got because they're going on one of those emotional triggers. And they could be creating some narrative that comes from the past because maybe it's a gesture, a word, something that's happening in the moment, right? Mm-hmm. But they're emotionally triggered by that. I tell coaching clients all the time, if it's hysterical, it's historical, right? If you have a strong reaction to something, you're probably having an emotional trigger. In terms of your relationships, and this is particularly important when we're all concerned about our careers nowadays. Sometimes it's okay to be relatively transactional about how you deal with people, but not necessarily under pressure because, again, that emotional water level, everybody's feeling a lot of tension. You really have to be present and strive to establish a little bit more human, authentic rapport with other people. I think that's incredibly important. Mm-hmm. So we go to how this comes out in the book. We've got Robert Hitchens. Something happened. He has an emotional trigger. He's creating a narrative that justifies shutting down and going through all this patter about how they're all doomed. He's cranky. He's acting out, and he's frozen. We go to Margaret Brown. something happens. She's in the same situation. She is acknowledging her thoughts and feelings and actions in the present. She's taking those strategic pauses where she's facing the fact that, sure, she's terrified. Yeah, she's freezing. But she's not letting those feelings capsize her. It's almost like little short stills in a movie. Mm-hmm. She's able to get in touch with the emotional reality of those feelings in the present moment, say, yeah, I'm scared to death, right? And then get back into what she's able to do in the present moment and not try to solve the whole thing, because who could? We don't know. But
Absolutely.
able to, right? But just able to identify, like, feet in front of you. What is the next positive row of the oar I can take? And that, I think, Scott, is critical for people today. That's why I think this lifeboat metaphor is valuable right now. Because when we're looking at our careers, how we're going to educate our kids, how we're going to pull our communities together at this difficult time. We all, for some reasons you and I could debate all afternoon, have more questions than answers, aren't really sure about what's going on with some of these different sources of information. Mm-hmm. So we need to center ourselves. We need to be right where we are in terms of common sense and looking at what's right in front of us, right? Yeah. We need to stay even with those emotional triggers, but we also need to just really look at the next positive thing we can do. And if you put this process into practice that way at the individual level, and I can go on and talk about how this impacts the way you deal with others and organizations, but if you do that at the individual level, you have the highest probability of navigating this period and getting your family through it, mm-hmm. staying on course, and hopefully setting yourself up for success once this crisis abates. And it will, right?
Yeah, eventually, yeah. Well,
eventually.
I think one of the points you did point out, one of the things you did point about Margaret Brown in the book was not only was she on track to help everybody there because she she was an authentic leader or an example of that in action without even wanting to be a leader, right? Mm-hmm. She wasn't expecting anybody to be writing a play or a musical about her or have Kathy Bates play her in a movie in the 1990s, right? That's the image. I see Kathy Bates for some reason. But the idea is that she also was on a mission to get to her ill grandson. So she had a bigger quest along the way, right? I mean, she had a bigger vision, and she didn't mm-hmm. let anything deter her from that. And I wonder how much of that plays into this lifeboat metaphor.
I think that's an excellent observation, and I really appreciate it, Scott, because I was thinking about that more and more after I had written the manuscript. Mm-hmm. And the book was published. It's interesting. You write something, and then as people start to read it and have their own relationship with the concepts, right? You as a writer have one vantage point on it. Readers have another. It occurred to me more and more that this was pretty important because, again, poor Robert Hitchens was a gentleman who was just grateful to have a job, right? He'd do anything you told him to do because you know how difficult the shipping industry was. So he was probably coming apart in all different ways emotionally.
Absolutely.
Right? Margaret Brown's self-image was not on the line. But what was on the line was her ability to survive and what she noticed with other people, which I really think helped her create a tone of unity. There was a source of strength that everyone ended up tapping into by the time they were done and they survived that night, was the fact that she not only was focused herself on living to see her grandson, I think that motivation connected her at a very powerful level with other women on that lifeboat who wanted to live to see their husbands again, wanted to live to see their children again, mm-hmm. wanted to live to see their relatives again. I mean, Correct. That's a pretty powerful motivator, right?
Yeah. Yeah. How would you apply that to a business setting? Like that kind of a motivator? What are those kind of motivators in practice if you're trying to navigate stormy seas in business?
Well, I think one of the things that's really helpful about the lifeboat process when we're dealing with people in a professional setting mm-hmm. is that it reminds you that there are some things you cannot do without the help of other people. Like, for instance, you cannot row a lifeboat across the icy waters of the Atlantic in the middle of all these icebergs by yourself. And when it comes to a career, one of the things that I've learned over the years as a coach, and I've learned a lot from my clients, is that you cannot get perspective on things you'd prefer not to know about yourself and are really good at minimizing or distracting yourself from without feedback from other people. And we need that, particularly under pressure. Because often in business, you'll find that people can have great ideas, but people are integral to making things happen in a professional context. Okay. Right. So as a coach, I've had the pleasure, and I mean that really, it's been a privilege, to do all sorts of different feedback situations in a bunch of different business contexts. So sometimes we do performance feedback, sometimes we do communication surveys with organizations, but there is a way of making a shift from just a transactional approach to a type of feedback that the Lifeboat process advocates. And I think it's not just great for people in terms of their jobs and careers and keeping teams motivated and mentoring well right now. I also think it's really important for people managing the dynamics in their families right now, because so many of us are working from home. Right. And that's feedback that doesn't go to this cognitive strategic, here's my challenge, what should I do? Should I take job A or job B? Should I hire person A or person B? Should we lay off 30% or 20%? It actually is feedback that goes right to the heart of whether you sound like you're being true to yourself under pressure. Because there's another thing I've learned about performance under pressure. It's that it's not necessarily the decisions an individual makes about their careers, their family, their health. It's confidence in their decision-making process that's going to pull them through a really challenging time. I say that from years on a trading floor because oftentimes you will do something and the market will move and things won't pan out the way you thought. But if you have a sound strategic decision-making process, the way you course correct is often more profitable than your original idea. Okay? It's just dynamic. So that happens with people too. So in the Lifeboat process, I'm reminding people how valuable relationships with others are, and pick ones where you have people that are emotionally honest enough to tell you what you need to hear, not just to play into what you want to hear. People you respect. Now, some of your listeners may already have this in their marriages. They may have friends on speed dial that they can bounce things off of all the time. Here's hoping. But if not, it's really interesting to think about who you can reach out to and ask questions under pressure like, do I sound like I'm being emotionally honest? Or does it seem like they're feelings I'm suppressing because I don't want to face them right now, right? Or do you think I'm being clear with myself about my motives? And if I'm not, why am I not doing that? Or do you think when I'm talking about somebody that's really triggering me, if I'm being objective and fair? And if I'm not, why aren't I? Because what we always want to do is align our thoughts and our feelings and our intentions under pressure so that we can stay present. Because again, as I keep repeating, the Lifeboat process is about navigating an environment where you have more questions than answers, right?
Exactly, yeah. And that ambiguous situations, like whether or not that's why projective testing works in psychology. You see how people are when they don't know what something is, what the situation is in front of them, right? And so those ambiguous situations do test our abilities, and there's a teachable moment. Speaking a bit of psychology, I want to kind of step back a little bit here, because what we're talking about is fascinating. But I know, having read the book, I can see where your training as a family therapist has really informed the book, and fluidly. Like, for instance, we were talking earlier about one of the case studies, there was a use of a kind of paradoxical intervention, if you will. You don't do that. I don't know if you call it an intervention in coaching, but it's certainly a way of applying. It's like, this will work. This might work here. Let's try this. How does your training in Ackerman family systems and Virginia Statier's work, like conjoint family therapy, how does your family systems model work? Like, how does it inform your work as a coach? I know that there's very little there's a lot of blurry lines between coaching and therapy. I know a lot of times when I'm working with people who are from consulting firms or in finance, a lot of times I kind of approach things. It would look more like coaching or like light level career counseling, and then kind of incorporate some of those other deeper aspects of emotional functioning and whatnot. But I wonder how that works for you and how it's played out.
Well, I think that this kind of goes to the iceberg metaphor too, Scott, but I think that we see behavior in the workplace that can give us a sense of some of the emotional triggers and norms that were set in a person's family system. Things they react strongly to, things they take in stride. And I think before the podcast, we were even talking about Salvador Minuchin and the idea of the classic family system. Right. So when he wrote his book for Harvard some time ago, he was talking about your basic classic family system, which is sort of ideal. You have a balance of power between the male and female caregiver. You have kids that, have some respect for authority and look up to them for guidance. The parents tend to be a united front, all of this. And then, as you know, I had the pleasure of attending the Ackerman Institute and getting certified there.
Wow.
Well, where I really saw a crossroads between my experience in the business world, working with high pressure situations and people, and what was going on with that was I looked at the two basic building blocks of what I call anybody's power style, and that's their sort of inner emotional reactions. And the way that I look at it most of the time in a business environment is whether people are sort of gravitating to trust or fear. Okay. And that sort of comes from the family system, because you can almost have like a rainy day and a mom comes in and says, Cindy, do you want to wear the red raincoat or the green one? And then she's sort of going to trust and normalizing that you're going to have a voice in it. Or she comes in and she goes, Cindy, it's raining. Get this raincoat on right now. This is not a discussion. Right. So we've all had both, but somewhere, some percentage of the time, you're going to tend to one pole or another. Right. And then behaviorally, you have this ideal from Salvador Minuchin that the parents are going to operate as a united front. But in reality, that's not always the case. So you can have a situation where the same kid is baking cookies with her mom, and the cookies come out of the oven. And she says, Mom, can I have a cookie? And her mom goes, we talked about the fact that you need to clean up your room first, so no, right? And she may be able to trot right into the other room and go, Daddy, Mommy and I make cookies. Would you like one? And he goes, well, yes, honey, I would. Would you like one with me? And she goes, okay, Daddy, right? So can you, right, split the parents, or do you have to deal with them as a united front, right? So the way that I noticed this was I sort of broke the basic monikers. I think of them as primary colors on a palette for different types of family systems that are sort of branches off the classic, right? So I talked about the pleaser family system, which is people who really try to connect with other people personally, but they grow up in families where they don't get as much attention or validation, just not because their parents don't love them, just because their parents are preoccupied with making a living or a sick relative or what have you. But what you consistently see with your pleasers is that they really want validation and get very stressed out on the job when they think somebody's upset with them or they're not getting those compliments, right? Then you have your charmers, who are people who almost have to soothe a needy caregiver or become mommy or daddy's best friend, not because they come from a broken home, although they often do, but because the parents sort of grow apart emotionally and turn one of the kids into their sounding board rather than turn it to their spouse.
Yes, exactly.
You see it. You see it, right? And so you see behavioral dynamics from that. Then we've got what I call the commander power style, which are people who grow up in families where there's really a strict code of conduct and a rigid hierarchy. They care a lot more about where you are in the pecking order than what you have to say, right? And they usually come from households where there is one parent that rules the roost. It could be a matriarchy or a patriarchy. But one parent calls all the shots, and the other spouse is almost sort of down there working through it with the kids, right, in a slightly more subordinate position. And then we have inspirers, who, in contrast, come from homes where conformity really isn't stressed at all. It's more like free thinking and trusting yourself and all of this. And there is a really lovely characteristic of inspirers that I think led to some of my thinking around Lifeboat and that self-help to us help shift, which is I've noticed that inspirers are these remarkable people who tend to do things for other people before stopping to calculate what's in it for them. They're in a hurry, they'll give directions. A CEO is going in to see another CEO, and he will yuck it up with a receptionist he's never seen and spend as much time on that relationship as he will with a seed investor. I know that I was talking to Inspire the other week, who just, this guy was between jobs, and here we are in COVID. And he said, you won't believe it, Maggie. I mean, I went in to get my coffee. We all have to wear masks in Starbucks now. And this poor young lady was like, I'm late. I said, here, take my coffee. I just paid for it. Just go, honey. She went, and she turned out to be the receptionist of the place where he was interviewing. What can I say?
Very serendipitous, yeah.
Right? But what we've been able to do is look at those 4 core power styles and figure out that there's strengths and blind spots that we actually see in the workplace that statistically correlate oftentimes with these backgrounds people come from.
Well, it makes a lot of sense because business really, when it gets down to it, it's a family. Whether whatever your style is for fitting in your attachment style or your ability to function in these roles that you picked up in your own family, right. It's a family, and it has to. If it's going to function properly, it's probably going to be a better functioning family than a more dysfunctioning one. So it makes a lot of sense how your skills could translate so quickly and readily.
I think there are many great writers out there, Scott, who've talked about the idea that the sense of self is formed in relationship, right? Exactly. Remember, I'd spoken earlier about the relationship with self, others, and organizations. Well, the family system is the first system you were ever in. Mm-hmm. And the caregivers in the family system, even if you're adopted or whatever or whatever's going on with the people who raised you, these are the first people who ever had power over you in life, long before we had language. This was the template, right? So the way that you learn to respond, either by being charming or pleasing or acting tough, is ingrained in there. And that's why I say that inner iceberg, because we see the behavior on the tip of the iceberg that people are conscious of, but there's all these learned, conditioned responses underneath the surface that get tapped into and come a little bit closer to the surface in high-pressure situations.
Correct. Well, I'm curious, too. I'm sure you have coaching clients who you've worked with for years. I wonder if you ever hear, like, when you're working with them, that the transformations that you're helping them, you're pulling their strengths out of them, that's also affected positively their relationships with their spouse or their family or friends, or like I said, it must be more of a global response.
Absolutely. And, it also impacts the relationship with their families. I know that I had the pleasure of spending some time having a conversation with Hara Marino, who used to be an editor for Psychology Today, right, when Power Genes was coming out. And we were bonding over the simple concept that almost all memory is emotional memory, right, because we all have a subjective lens on that. It's state dependent too. Right. It is. It's state dependent too. So when you learn that you have the capacity for any of these different power styles in you, I mean, people can change power styles from room to room at a cocktail party, right? So you'll be a commander in one moment, perhaps with a family member, possibly a pleaser with your boss, maybe a charmer with an important client, and, an inspirer in a different situation. I mean, all these different strengths and blind spots get, play through people. It's very fluid. When you develop a little bit more self-acceptance and, dare I say, humility around how dynamic our behavior can be, you end up having a much easier time giving other people the benefit of the doubt. And that not only improves your relationships with your spouse and with your kids, I think one thing that I find poignant is many people have said they've made peace with the emotional memory of difficult parents They've really been able to reflect on things that had created an unfortunate narrative that they were coming back to over time. And after embracing this emotional agility and being able to actualize that under pressure on the job or even in a tense situation in the home, they could look back on formative experiences with their parents, which had struck them as something that was just not as wonderful as they had hoped it might have been, with far more compassion and perspective. And I think that brings people back to that alignment where they can be more objective and not necessarily have to create narratives inside themselves that justify isolating or being aggressive under pressure.
You're doing a lot of work, maybe the secondary gain of this, or the primary gain that's under the surface, is more of a metacognitive approach to their own mind, right? A theory
Absolutely.
of mind, right? To get technical, and but within the context of work, which they can generalize to other parts of life. Wow, wow, good stuff.
Well, thank you for that, Scott. And, I do tell business people that I've worked with for some time, there's so many coaching books and professional books on different kinds of conversations, kind conversations, strategic conversations, powerful conversations. And I tell my clients all the time, that's great, but the most important conversations are always going to be the ones you have with yourself. Because it's the conversations you're going to have with yourself, possibly at 2:00 in the morning during, COVID-19 and all this news, right, that are going to dictate the range of professional possibilities you feel ambitious enough to go for, that are going to dictate the confidence with which you handle yourself in an interview, the self-confidence you have in terms of even considering ways that you could professionally transition.
Correct.
Or how you handle yourself in a networking situation, or how you manage your kids on a tough day, right? It all goes to something much more important than just the words that you're using. It actually goes to, and what I mean by tone, I've had a lot of business people really sit on the edge of their seats when I tell them that their body language in something like a town hall, those nonverbal cues, are things that an audience is going to pick up on. Right. But where they don't think about things as much is that their body language is actually sending signals to themselves. So you can be an absolute pro, right? But you're sending yourself signals when you're a little tight or your mind's wandering or things like this. All these conversations we have with ourselves, we want to be as clear as possible about particularly how we're feeling, like Margaret Brown, whether we are feeling anxious or concerned about something, because under normal conditions, being able to compartmentalize is probably a great professional skill. But these are not normal conditions.
Correct.
And sometimes, right, we really need to know what we're feeling because it may be a signal that we do need to course correct. Or we do need to make a change. How do we make these decisions that, I'm setting this boundary here because it's time to focus on my family right now, And those are important things for people to bear in mind.
Yeah. Well, I think we should probably kind of wrap up here. I could talk for hours, and I'd love to have you back on, and maybe Charles, your husband, back on at some point.
That'd be great.
Another topic,
we'd love that.
Or just maybe to talk about like your coaching business and concepts in that, or something else altogether.
Sure.
And you have 3 books out now. Is that correct?
I do. The first book is called The Authentic Career, and that really is, I think, a structure for helping people really take a fresh look at what they want to do with their lives and careers and how they got there. I mean, are they going through their careers being who other people want them to be, or are they really tapping into their genuine passion and sense of purpose? Power Genes is the one we just discussed, which is, going to all these different power styles. That's the book that's published by Harvard Business Press. And then this new book, Lifeboat, which gives us this process that you've been gracious enough to discuss today.
Well, it's a wonderful book. It is available from New World Library, which is a cool press, and they're starting to put out a lot of these really cool kind of psychology and coaching-oriented books these days, more so than when I remember them, when they were more like they were doing a lot of new age kind of stuff years ago. I think they're publishing some real great stuff these days. Maggie Craddock, it's been a pleasure. Please don't be a stranger.
Thank you, Scott. Okay. I've really enjoyed this.
Okay. Thank you so much. Me too.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to us at iTunes, Spreaker, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. This podcast is for informative and entertainment purposes only. If you need a mental health professional, please seek one out. All material, copyright, The Psychology Talk Podcast. Music is provided by the band Serenati.